In video 3, we discussed the origins of the Socratic method and how Socrates was using this intense form of dialogue to try and awaken us to a more meaningful and reflective way of life. In this video, I want to build on the Socratic way of thought and how these ideas parallel and eventually merge with the type of meaning we observed in ancient Israel. If you want to be caught up, you can check out those videos first, or if you don't like being told how to live your life, just carry on from here. A study was given in which children were presented with 2 rows of candy and asked to choose which one they wanted. We can clearly see it doesn't matter which one they pick, because both rows contain 5, but almost every child would reliably pick the bottom row because it looked larger. A child's perspective is only able to focus in on a small amount of information. So, if something looks larger, in their mind, it must contain more. It is an illusion we can easily see through as adults, because we possess a perspective that the child does not. Before you take this information and begin rubbing it into the face of your 6-year-old, I want to show you one more example. The 9-dot puzzle is well known to many psychologists, and the challenge is to draw 4 continuous straight lines which go through the middle of all 9 dots without taking the pencil off the paper. It seems pretty straightforward. The problem is the way our mind frames this puzzle. We assume there is an invisible boundary which forms at the edge of the box that we cannot go beyond. But it is not until we step outside of our initial perception that we are able to solve it. When shown the answer, many will say this is cheating, but nowhere in the rules does it say, stay inside the box. That is a restriction we impose on ourselves. With his method of elenchus, Socrates was trying to shock people out of the 9 dots of their day-to-day concerns. He felt the narrow perspective of his fellow citizens was steering them towards a thoughtless and selfish life. Now we know Socrates was executed, partly for his disruptive form of philosophy, but mostly for pulling a Bart Simpson at his trial. Socrates never wrote anything down, so we don't have any first-hand accounts of his life. Everything we know about him comes from second-hand accounts. The most notable of these were by Socrates' student Plato. Plato was traumatized by the execution of his mentor, and he spends the rest of his life trying to understand how people could be so foolish and so self-destructive that they would kill someone as wise as Socrates. Plato begins writing his dialogues, which were essentially little plays, most of which center around Socrates and his method of elenchus. He did not write these dialogues simply for us to read or encounter the viewpoint of Socrates. Instead, Plato is trying to get us to see something about ourselves. What he is trying to get us to realize ties in with the 2 experiments we did at the beginning of this video. Let's say we take a child who is looking at a problem they want to solve. This is the child's perspective of the problem, and the parent is there trying to help them. Of course, the perspective of the adult encompasses so much more, because they have more life experience. As the adult helps them, the child will begin to imitate the words and actions of the adult. One of the reasons our species has thrived is that we are very powerful imitators, and we have an intense trust in those we imitate. This was shown very strongly in an experiment in which a chimp and a child are each shown an opaque box. The adult pulls and presses a series of levers, and a candy comes out. The chimp watches and does everything the human does and gets the candy. Then they repeat the experiment with the child, who does the same thing. They repeat the steps and get the candy. Then the experiment is repeated with a box that is now completely transparent, so it is obvious that the last action is the only thing that releases the candy. And then the box is turned over to the chimp, and the chimp does only the last action and gets the candy. Then they give it to the child, and the child repeats all the steps they can clearly see are useless. Not looking so good for Team Human. But there's something very important happening here. The child may see that all the steps are useless, but they repeat them anyway, because a child trusts that the adult has a perspective which is greater than theirs, and has some purpose beyond what they can understand. As the child imitates, they are gaining the ability to internalize the adult's perspective. It is very hard for us to recognize our own biases because we live within our own perspective, and it can be very difficult to see through it. When the child begins to take on the perspective of the adult, they can now take on goals that are much more long-term and far-reaching. Eventually, the child doesn't need the adult around anymore. They have gained the ability to take on a perspective of their own. The child moves to adulthood by internalizing the mind of an adult. But, as we showed in the 9-dot problem, I have my own biases that I can become trapped in. If I approach this problem as a connect the daughter, solving a connect the dot problem, I will keep making the same mistakes. But it is possible that there is a perspective that is greater than mine, which I could internalize to become wiser. This is our idea of a sage. They represent a perspective that can see above and beyond what we can. Like the child is to the adult is to the sage. I can become wiser by internalizing someone wiser than me. That is why Plato wants to give us Socrates enacted as a living person. He believes that if we can internalize Socrates, we can reorganize our psyche to live a more harmonious and meaningful life. Plato wants to understand why humanity is so prone to foolish and self-destructive behavior, and he creates a psychological theory to account for this. He says that each of us has 3 centers of cognition. There is the monster, which represents the appetite, the lion, which represents honor, and the man, which represents reason. He believed these 3 centers of our cognition were constantly getting into conflict, and anyone who has ever tried to set long-term goals knows this to be true. The recidivism and failure rate for any new diet is around 95%. The reasoning part of our brain knows we should eat better. That would make us healthier and happier, but our appetite overpowers our long-term goals. Another part of our psyche is responsible for looking at all the possible consequences our actions might have in the future. But we all know this voice is much, much quieter. The final piece of this model is the lion. It is not quite our emotions or feelings, but more like our spirit. The lion represents our socialization. It represents that process of internalization we talked about earlier. It is how we adopt the perspective of other people onto ourselves. Plato says that we can teach the man, who can then train the lion, and together the lion and the man can control the monster. It is the internalization of Socrates, or the sage, which empowers us to deal with our own self-destructive tendencies. This is a radical transformation and reorganization of the psyche. And Plato argues that we have a fundamental desire to do this. We want this conflict to be resolved. We want to experience inner peace, and we are craving a culture within ourselves. Plato takes these ideas and links them together in his most famous story, the allegory of the cave. There is a group of people who are trapped in a cave, chained, facing a wall with a fire burning behind them, and puppeteers casting shadows against the wall of the cave. The people chained cannot turn their heads. They can only watch the shadows, and they believe these are what is real. One person gets free from his chains and turns around. At first, he is blinded by the light of the fire, until his eyes adjust and he can now look at his surroundings. The fire reveals a pathway going up and out of the cave. As he starts to walk up the pathway, the light of the real world blinds him even more, until again, his eyes adjust. And now he can see the real world outside of the cave. He wants to see the source of all the light in the world, so he observes the sun. And then he goes back down into the cave to tell the rest of the people that what they think is real is an illusion. Of course, his eyes are now adjusted to the light, not the dark, and he stumbles about and looks like nothing but a madman. To Plato, it is the philosopher that makes this ascent, and this journey into the light is Plato's theory of enlightenment. So, here is our psyche. It is disorganized. Our different natures are at war with each other. We learn to internalize Socrates, or the sage, which puts us a little more in order. As we do this, our inner conflict is reduced. We can see into the world more clearly. We are more connected to reality and how things really are. As we see the world more clearly, what is real, what is truthful now becomes more salient to us. It starts to have more of an impact on our psyche. We are less trapped within our biased perspectives. We gain more inner peace, which in turn allows us to see even more deeply into reality. This allows us to internalize the sage even deeper, and this process continues to feed back onto itself. This is how we walk out of the cave. This is Plato's ascent into the light. To Plato, this is what makes life meaningful. and it was this meaning that Socrates was willing to die for. We can see that this is different from the form of meaning we saw in ancient Israel. Both focus on moving from the mundane world of self-deception and self-destruction into the real world, or the world of paradise. In future videos, we are going to look at how these ideas merge and grow together. Then, we're going to look at how they were all lost. And that is the meaning crisis we detailed in episode 1.